My name is Joseph Capizzi. I am the Executive Director of the Institute for Human Ecology. I am also an ordinary professor of moral theology here at the Catholic University of America, where I've been for over 20 years. Obviously something serious brings us together today, and we're going to have a wonderful conversation about that. But before we do, it's my pleasure to introduce and to invite up President John Garvey, the 15th President of the Catholic University of America. He's a graduate of Harvard Law, a former professor of law at the University of Kentucky and the University of Notre Dame. He served for over a decade as the dean of Boston College's School of Law, and he's the author of a few books, many books, two of which have won awards. In addition to that, he has argued before the Supreme Court on multiple occasions. He's written in major American, or pretty much all the major American newspapers. He's written also for the Atlantic Monthly, and I think as well the Chronicle for Higher Education. But I think his greatest pride is in being a proud father, grandfather, and husband. It's my pleasure to introduce John Garvey.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks to all of you for coming. This is the first of 4 sessions on the crisis affecting our church, and those 4 sessions are in part a piece of a much larger project on the church and the laity, which I'll say a word about in a moment. Next semester, we're going to host 3 more conferences that will deal with the roots of the current crisis and the theological foundations for lay reform and some principles for lay action. Tonight, as Joe said, we're going to hear from 4 journalists on the media's role in investigating and reporting and framing our understanding of the crisis. I want to say a few words about that. I was in Boston in 2002 when that happened, but 2018 is different from 2002. That time around, I think it was mostly about wayward priests, Paul Shanley, John Geoghegan. In 2002, I think most Catholics trusted that the bishops would take care of the problem, that we had a lot of stuff to get over, but that we would get past it. Today, I think many Catholics see the bishops themselves as the problem. The faithful have lost trust in the bishops. I think this is so for 2 reasons, and the more important of the 2, I think in terms of the causation, is the revelation that Archbishop McCarrick was himself guilty of some of the sins that some parish priests had committed, and the suspicion that a number of high-ranking church officials must have known about this. Second, of course, was the release of the Pennsylvania grand jury report, which made allegations about bishops in 6 dioceses across the state over several decades. As a result of these things, as I said, the faithful have lost trust in the bishops. At the moment, they're still the faithful, but faith without trust is not sustainable. Every spring I teach a class for first-year students in our honors program called The Virtues. We study the cardinal and the theological virtues, and in our examination of the virtue of faith, the first thing we learn is, as Joseph Pieper says, that to believe always means to believe someone and to believe something. Faith arises from a belief in the witness of a credible person. Our own faith is ultimately in Jesus as the ultimately credible person who brings us the gospel. But as Catholics, we also recognize that Christ gave us the church, whose visible hierarchy includes the bishops. They're the successors to the apostles, who serve the church as an ongoing chain of credible witnesses. And implicit in our faith is our trust in these witnesses. As the Second Vatican Council says in Lumen Gentium, bishops teaching in communion with the Roman Pontiff are to be respected by all as witnesses to divine and Catholic truth. The crisis of our time is that so many Catholics have lost respect for the bishops because our trust in them has been broken. So what does this mean for our faith? Each of us is called to be a saint. For each of us, the path to sainthood will include our response to this crisis. This means coming to face with whether we have faith in the church or not and what that requires. Today, it means making an act of faith in our clergy as a step towards healing the breach of trust. Doesn't mean thinking that the bishops are doing everything right. We can foster unity by bringing our disagreements to respectful dialogue. It does mean putting our faith in the unity of the church, even when it seems easier to say, I've lost respect for my bishop, but I still have my parish priest. It means putting our faith in the bishop's commitment to reform, even when the process is frustrating and slow. We intentionally scheduled this session that we're having today to follow the USCCB's fall meeting in Baltimore last week to pick up their lead on new reform measures, and then the Vatican asked the bishops not to vote until after the synod in February. In the press conference following that announcement, Cardinal DiNardo, the president of the USCCB, was asked why the bishops didn't just go ahead and vote on the reforms anyway. He said, rightly, we are Roman Catholic bishops in communion with our Holy Father in Rome, and we're responsible to him. We need to join him in making that act of faith. Today, we're gathered at the National University of the Catholic Church to launch our conference series and other programs on this crisis. This initiative, an opportunity for dialogue between the laity and the episcopacy, is part of the university's response. From these conferences, I think will come more programs and proposals about how we as lay people can support and inform our bishops as they work to heal the current breach of trust. So I want to close by thanking all of you for coming tonight. This is an important step, and by asking you now to turn your attention to a short video on the initiative that will provide the framework for Catholic University's response to this issue. So thank you very much for coming tonight.
Crisis. Its inability to address clergy sexual abuse has caused a crisis of faith, a breach of trust. To restore that trust, the Church needs the help of the lay faithful. Over 50 years ago, Vatican II articulated the role of the laity in the Catholic Church in a document entitled Lumen Gentium. It teaches that all members, not just the clergy, contribute toward the renewal and building up of the Church. The very vocation of the laity is to engage in temporal affairs. The clergy are tasked to shepherd the faithful, to ensure the laity receive the spiritual goods of the Church, and to recognize the laity's ministries and charisms so that they may cooperate in this common undertaking. Lumen Gentium says pastors should willingly employ the lay faithful's prudent advice and confidently assign duties to them in service to the Church. The Catholic University of America is where laity and clergy come together in a spirit of mutual respect and charity to address the most challenging issue of our times. With the help of the laity, pastors can more clearly and more incisively come to decisions regarding both spiritual and temporal matters. In this way, the whole Church, strengthened by each one of its members, may more effectively fulfill its mission for the life of the world.
Applause is appropriate. People worked hard on that, right, Karna? All right, great. Now we're going to move to the panel. It's a real thrill and pleasure to have Ross Douthat be with us today. Ross helped put the panel together. It was really his idea, the people that are going to be speaking with him today. Let me say a few words about Ross. Most of you, of course, know him as an Institute for Human Ecology Fellow. In addition to that, I believe he writes op-eds for his local newspaper, the New York Times. Previously, he was editor at The Atlantic. He's the author, most recently, of To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism. He co-hosts the Times Op-Eds Pages New podcast. Is that still new? God help us. Yeah. Okay, called The Argument. He's film critic for the National Review, and he lives in New Haven, Connecticut with his wife and 3 children. So, welcome. Thank you, Ross.
Thank you, Joe. I don't know if I can take full credit for assembling this dream team, but my hope is that they will be so awesome and interesting that I will hardly have to say anything at all. So I'm going to give them each a quick introduction and then ask a general question, and then we will be off to the races, hopefully for about 45 or 50 minutes. And then, having said all the brilliant things we can possibly say, we will open the floor to your brilliant questions. And I'm told that people can also communicate questions electronically, which will then appear magically on the glowing iPad under my chair. So we will have a mix of enfleshed, incarnate questions and questions that are received as if from angelic beings, or whoever's on the internet. So these will be very short bios because all of these people really need no introduction. But to my immediate right is Christopher White, who's the national correspondent for Crux and for The Tablet. Chris has an MA in Ethics and Society from Fordham, a BA in Politics, Philosophy, and Economics from the King's College. He's the former director of Catholic Voices USA and has written for an array of dazzling publications in his career. Immediately to his right is Elizabeth Bruenig, who, like me, writes op-ed columns for a living for her sins, but for the Washington Post, so she has a much easier time of it. No. But she writes on Christianity, politics, public life, occasionally Batman and Star Wars, if we're lucky. Previously, she was an editor for the Post's Outlook and Post Everything sections and a staff writer at the New Republic, and she received her MPhil in Christian theology from the University of Cambridge, where she studied as a Marshall Scholar, which is very impressive. And finally, J.D. Flynn is the editor-in-chief of the Catholic News Agency, not the Catholic News Agency.
We're fine with the article.
You're fine with
I have very little opinion about the article.
Which is a global news service owned by the EWTN Media Network. Previously, Flynn was the special assistant to Bishop James Conley in the Diocese of Lincoln, Nebraska. He was chancellor of the Archdiocese of Denver, and he's taught canon law at St. John Vianney Theological Seminary, which means he brings a range of experiences beyond the merely journalistic that will probably come up in the course of our
I just want to say about that, my canon law degree is from here, the Catholic University of America, and one of my professors of canon law is here in the room, which means he alone at this point knows how high my propensity for BS is when I don't know anything. So,
well, maybe he'll ask a question.
Right, that may well be. Right.
So thank you guys all for being here. I'm going to start out with a very general question, which is, you're all journalists, we're all journalists, and the journalist's vocation is, at its best at least, to seek out the truth, tell true stories about the world, write those true stories, ideally in an entertaining and interesting fashion. And in certain ways, the story of what's happening in Roman Catholicism is a journalist's dream, in the sense that it is a remarkable human drama. It's a crisis in the world's oldest religious institution. It's a complex story that creates situations where journalists can do their work incredibly well. At the same time, you're all Catholics. Not only that, are we all converts on this panel?
Guilty.
Sort of?
Ish, yeah.
Ish?
Mm-hmm.
I was a teenage convert, so maybe I'm ish too. Sure. So, ish. But, so we all are committed to the institution that we're covering. Not only are we committed to it, we think that it is the means through which God has willed the salvation of the human race. And that makes, I would say, covering the church at this moment complicated. And I wonder if each of you, starting with you, because you're sitting next to me, could just say a little bit about sort of the experience of writing about the scandal as a journalist and as a Catholic at the same time, and sort of how that plays out in your work.
So you're starting with the softball question.
The softball. I promised it would be easy.
I think it's profoundly exciting and profoundly challenging. When I first got into reporting, which was certainly an accident, but I found that's actually how you get your best stories, are typically accidents. I remarked to a number of people that I'm sort of sad that I didn't live through 2002, because it must have been such a ride to cover that. And well, here we are in 2018, and I think most people that covered 2002 would say it's far worse than 2002. And so it's a constant toll, but I miss going to Mass and not sort of listening to the prayers of the faithful and wondering if there's going to be a prayer for survivors. I miss sort of thinking about my Cardinal Archbishop as just that, someone who I respect, not someone I cover. I miss sort of always feeling like I have to sort of observe my faith as well as practice it. So those are certainly challenges. It's a tightrope. But to see the institution up close in the midst of it is also a source of, strange hope. What happened last week in Baltimore, which I'm sure we will discuss at great length soon, was immensely challenging, surprising to a lot of us, but to also sort of see the reactions, the leadership at its best and at its worst, and some mix thereof. It is in its own way faith affirming as well to see people that really care about this and getting it right, and to you as a journalist to challenge them in that process is also rewarding as well. So it's all of those things. It's messy, but it's worth the mess. So.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that there are a lot of non-Catholic journalists, religion journalists who are also covering this, and I think the different dimension that arises when you are a Catholic journalist covering it is that for survivors or for people who are whistleblowers or people who are in some way traumatized by what's happened directly or peripherally, when they talk to a Catholic journalist, there's a different kind of relationship there. A lot of these people feel like they're trying to tell their stories and get some kind of response, and the institutional church is just kind of frozen. And I think the meeting in Baltimore is a good example of that. They just feel like there's no access and there's no response, and that every response they get is about a further response that will be forthcoming, if they get anything at all. So when they talk to a Catholic journalist, I think a lot of these people actually get some benefit from it, because at least it's a fellow Catholic who's listening. Someone inside the church who's going through the same thing you are going through cares in a very real and material way. And there's a therapeutic element, especially when people disclose stories about sexual exploitation or assault to journalists. They're oftentimes telling their stories the first time. That's been my experience with a few victims I've worked with. And I take a lot of solace in that, because the other side of it is that, when you're an ordinary Catholic who's going to Mass every Sunday and taking your kids there, every week you show up with a new story in your head. And, just stuff you didn't know before that is indelible now. You can't unknow it. And it's not great news. And so I think it's difficult. It's difficult for the people who are covering it. I had an experience where I went to the Prince George County Courthouse to pull criminal files on a priest who was convicted in 1986 of the molestation of 3 minors and given 25 years. And so I had to tell the clerk to pull it off microfiche, because they're not just sitting in the courthouse at that point. And so the clerk pulled it off the microfiche, printed the pages, and I had given him names and dates so he could make sure that he was getting the right thing. And he eventually brought me the stack of pages and said, "You can read this if you want. I don't want to see anymore." And I thought, well, my job's going to be to go home tonight and wait till my 2-year-old goes to sleep and then read all of it. And so that's difficult. And I do hope that the victims and the survivors who are working with journalists and Catholic journalists, like I said, adds that different dimension. I hope that they're getting something good out of it, and I hope that it's not having an overall detrimental effect either. So it's very challenging. It's very complicated.
I think for me, for our agency, I think our faith is sort of the animating principle of the work that we do. I believe the church is and is becoming one holy, Catholic, and apostolic, because she is those things by divine institution, and yet she's always in need of reform. And in always being in need of reform, she's always in need of purification. And I think for us, from my perspective, our baptism makes us responsible, co-responsible for the life and the mission of the church and for the holiness of the church. It's been an extremely difficult grace to be able to do that in this way, where I think part of the job is to recognize that for Catholic journalists right now, there's something of a prophetic dimension, because we're pointing to things that are true, and in pointing to things that are true, I think by that very fact, calling the church to a deeper conversion, to a deeper kind of commitment to live as she's according to what she says is true. So that's hard. I've been angry and disappointed and frustrated, and not only sort of in the institution, qua institution, but in people that I care about and that I know. I've been hanging around the church for a long time, so people that I know and respect and love who have let me down in various ways, and all of us have that experience. Every Catholic has that experience in one way or another right now. But I do think there's a sense in which all of us are responsible for the holiness of the church, and this is the way that we do it. But I think all of us have to kind of figure out and discern what it is that we're to do right now for the mission of the church and for the kingdom.
Do you think, so none of us were really active as journalists, right, during 2002.
Right.
So we can't necessarily speak to this perfectly, but...
I was 11.
Oh, dear God. For a while, whenever I would do an event, they would introduce me as the youngest columnist, the youngest op-ed columnist at the New York Times, and so I'm extremely grateful for Liz's youth. And I was going to say, though, that if you go back to the late 90s and really up until what broke in Boston broke, the default attitude of the institutional church towards journalists, secular journalists, and also the then pretty small number of Catholic journalists covering the story was that this was a witch hunt, that this was the secular press. It was the secular press going after the church because it didn't like the church, or it was sort of malcontent liberal Catholics or traditionalist Catholics sometimes going after the church because of their theological gripes. And then after Boston, you would see more often prominent churchmen saying, well, the press did something right. They did what we couldn't do ourselves. Not always and everywhere, but you had a little more of that. What do you think, for the people who on the inside of the institutional church, who you guys are talking to and writing about and on, what do you feel like the attitude is? And I know it varies a lot, right? Towards you.
Well, I think in preparation for the Baltimore meeting, I went back and watched Archbishop Gregory's talk in 2002 in Dallas, and he was the president of the conference at the time. And he had some very strong things to say about the good service the media has done the church in sort of bringing this crisis to light, both the Catholic media and the secular media. But then he does sort of have this caveat that there have also been caricatures that the media has put forward, and he has a number of lines in which he strikes back against the media a bit. I don't feel like that was on display as much from sort of the dais in Baltimore. I think most of the bishops that I talked to were willing to speak in confidence, one-on-one, but few, it takes a lot to go up and face the press, and we were fortunate to have a team of USCCB comms people that tried to provide the help that they could, but sometimes it was pulling teeth. Now, in terms of their broader perception, I think the Catholic press is often treated differently than the secular press. There was a bishop who, from the floor of the plenary last week, said, we bishops should be grateful for the presidency of Donald Trump because he's diverted the attention from us. So I think there is sort of that sentiment as well. Another bishop suggested that they should invest in sort of funding or consultants sort of to show all the good work that's been done since 2002. So I think that, folks are trying to strike this fine line between sort of recognizing the good of the media, but also sort of protecting their own camp. So.
Yeah, I've seen a big diversity of attitudes in terms of how to deal with reporting this. So the folks who are still involved in the institution who were attached to McCarrick in any way, that's very tender. So when you talk to those people and you kind of start searching around in those areas, Newark, New York, DC, you get a lot of, why are you doing this? This was so many years ago. What do you hope to gain from this? This is an ill old man, et cetera, et cetera. So you get a lot of, very hearty pushback in those areas. On the other hand, there are quite a few bishops who are very forthcoming and who didn't like that as much as anyone didn't like it, and who are very interested in, providing information that can help with reporting or, establishing facts. Most of the work of reporting is just is boring, right? It's not. It's can I
That's why
verify?
I never do it.
So it's like, can you verify a person who says they were here in 1982 reasonably could have been? Or if a guy says he was in New York in 1979, can we find a phone number or an address that verifies that? And so a lot of times people inside the institution can be very helpful toward that end. And sometimes you get stubbornness. McCarrick is an area where there's been a lot of, tenderness, soreness, if you want to think about it that way. But then, outside of those nodes, there's been a lot of real honesty and openness and really searching thoughts that have come from people inside the institution, I think, as well, from bishops, and especially priests and seminarians, who seem to kind of be at ground zero, because they're dealing with the lay faithful every day. So I've been very heartened by a lot of those conversations as well.
We broke something this summer, I can't remember what, but there was something that we broke this summer that was starting to generate some attention, and a bishop called me, not kind of a bishop who I know well, actually, I didn't even know how he got my number, but a bishop called me and said, thank you, and not someone who I would expect sort of to be in my sort of tribe in the church, but thank you for doing this, and please keep naming names, and please keep going after this, and we need this for the purification of the church, and thank you, and thank you. Well, the closer we got to his diocese, the more the thank yous started to dry up, and then it was, how did you get this number? Well, you called me, remember? So I think that bishops, like anybody, recognize that there is a problem in the church, and maybe a constellation of problems that are connected and we don't quite know how. At the same time, I think there's a legitimate apprehension among bishops about one of those problems, namely which is that we really don't know in the church what to do about clerics, priests, deacons, and bishops who have sexual relationships with grown-ups. Our law doesn't provide good guidance on that. I think since 2002 and after the charter, we've gotten pretty good, some notable kind of outliers accepted, we've gotten pretty good at knowing what to do when someone makes an allegation about behavior that involves a child. The institution knows what to do with that, even if sometimes she fails. There's been, I think, a cultural change that's come out of the charter and the aftermath. But bishops are largely on their own when it comes to knowing what to do with priests who act out sexually with grown-ups, and there's a lot of ambiguity. And as a consequence of that, I think bishops are concerned that the decisions that they've tried to make, really in the absence of guidelines, will be painted in a way that will make them look as if they too are sort of a McCarrick protecting monster. And so, I think there's a way in which that could begin to happen. Everybody on this dais likes the traffic that we've been getting from this, right? I mean, that's part of journalism now, is that we have to pay the bills by the number of people who click on our website, right? And so everybody, this is a story that has garnered a lot of attention for that reason. And as people begin to probe further and further for leads, I think some of those leads will be more and more tenuous, and bishops are concerned about that. And so we have to figure out, I think, as journalists, what the stories are and what they aren't, and how to tell the stories that are very murky that I think will be sort of the next round.
Yeah.
What about Rome's attitude? And then maybe this is more for JD and Chris, because you both operate within, explicitly Catholic-focused publications. Do you feel like, this gets into sort of bigger questions about sort of the European-American divide maybe on some of these things, but do you feel like I have heard that there is a certain, let's call it exasperation in some quarters in Rome with how the Catholic press in the U.S. has covered this? Do you guys get any sense of that? Does that exist? Can you speak to it?
Chris?
Go ahead. A few things to say. One, so we have the chance to cover bishops all the time, but when we talk about Rome, the person everyone wants to talk to, of course, is the Pope, and there are very limited windows in which the press gets to have access at the Pope, and those are papal plane trips when he does his press conference on the way back. So in terms of getting answers from the top, which is what everyone wants, those are, of course, limited. And, in terms of the Vatican Press Office, I think what they're able to do is limited as well, because, they're working with, frankly, a number of dicasteries and, all the way up to the Pope, where people are insular and they don't want to talk. That being said, I think, Greg Burke, who runs the Vatican press office, is an American himself, so I think he has a good sense of how the press works. He was a journalist long before he became a spokesperson for the Pope. And I think there is this sort of effort to sort of aid where they can be of assistance, but it's this both and. I mean, there are certainly doors that are closed. I think it's tough to often get, after the Vigano letter came out in August, all eyes were on the Congregation for Bishops. And that's been a hard office to penetrate, and understandably so. It's a very powerful office. So I think it really depends on who and where you're looking. In terms of sort of fatigue about the American sort of interest in this, I think there is this sort of puzzlement. Someone, a non-American made this comparison. Only in America are you going to have shows about cold cases. This sort of desire to look toward the past, look at and dig up the past. I don't know if that is entirely true, but that was how they tried to sort of push back against sort of the American effort to sort of understand what was happening. So,
yeah, I think one thing that it's important to understand is that the Vatican is not a monolith. It's a collection of offices that have varying degrees of dysfunctional relationships with one another, and so it's hard to sort of say the Vatican is this. But one thing that has happened that I certainly have observed is that there's a perception among many people in Rome, or at least some people in Rome, that a lot of what Americans are upset about is in sort of anti-Francis creed, that Americans have sort of jumped on this to advance their anti-Francis agenda with, that's theological. And there are people who have jumped on this to advance their anti-Francis agenda, and there are people who haven't, and it's important, I think, that we distinguish those things as clearly as we can, but that probably has colored some Roman perceptions, and you can see it with the Vigano letter. I mean, for Vigano himself, separating out what he has to say about McCarrick et al., and separating out what he has to say about the current sort of theological wars of the church is extremely difficult, and then for those who respond to him from the Vatican, they conflate those things all the more, and so then it's very easy for us to divide into our ideological camps and to sort of run the entire sexual abuse crisis that we're experiencing through our sort of ordinary amoris laetitia lines of demarcation, because we've already created them, and so we can just sort of, and so that's a Rome problem, but it's also, I think, an American problem and a journalist problem. We all should want the answers about coercive sexual activity of bishops and priests and cover-ups thereof. But it very quickly, sort of, those things very quickly get intermixed with our theological disagreements. And
I remember back in, I want to say January, there was a big conference in Rome where it sort of brought together the Amoris Laetitia dissenters and the China dissenters. And we had this conversation about whether or not that was, if you consider that an effective strategy, this big tent sort of Francis resistance movement. And I think we've seen that sort of play out with the sex abuse crisis as well in certain quarters.
So do you guys think, this is my working hypothesis, and here we can start getting into what actually happened or didn't happen in Baltimore. My hypothesis is that one big reason that there is this seeming sort of just impasse in terms of actually figuring out what the concrete steps are to move forward, whether they're specific to an investigation of McCarrick or whether they're more general, having to do with what you do about priests and bishops who have lovers, that it is this theological civil war that's basically now the big obstacle, because both sides of that war, and of course it's more complicated than just a two-sided thing, but there are sort of broad camps, both sides think that the other side has an agenda that's ultimately about, theological conservatism or theological liberalism.
Oh, the other side definitely has an agenda.
Right,
yeah.
But not us, right? But is that, do you think from sort of being more on the ground, is that actually what happened in Baltimore? Why did that happen?
Judy, you have the first stab at it. I took the last one.
Yeah, first of all, what happened in Baltimore, right? I think we're still trying to answer that to varying degrees. What happened in Baltimore is a good question, but the bishops went in with a plan that they thought was going. They wanted to come out with something that they could hold up and say to American Catholics, "See, we take this stuff as seriously as you do, and we feel your pain, so to speak, and we're going to move forward, and we want you to trust us." That's what they wanted. And privately, lots of bishops would say we have various kinds of issues with the documents that we're going to use to do that. But what they wanted was the win. and to come out and say in a unified way, we care about this stuff. And the Holy See put that on ice with the expectation of this February meeting. I think many people think, okay, so after the February meeting, there's not going to be sort of a unified global strategy on this subsequent to the February meeting, so the can is being kicked pretty far down the road. And I watched bishops who were extremely frustrated with that, and that said to me a lot about how much the bishops understood at least the importance of this issue for Catholics. Now, I listened to them later and thought, well, maybe they don't really understand what this issue is for Catholics, but at least they understood the importance of it, and I think they felt like they were cut off at the knees.
Yeah, I think from the perspective of a lot of the lay faithful, when you ask the question, what happened in Baltimore, the answer is nothing.
Right. And that's, I think, a very fair, I mean, that was certainly the lead I wrote in my story. But with that, there's a lot to unpack. I mean, we had the bishops' meeting kicking off on November 12th. Cardinal DiNardo said these documents were finalized on October 30th. We still don't know when they actually went to Rome.
Right.
Multiple canonists, JD can speak into this if he wishes, but had said to me that, there are canonical problems, that the letter that Cardinal DiNardo received had outlined some of those. We don't know that. That's not a public letter. But the fact that when discussions on these proposals did start the second day, these proposals, many of these bishops had serious criticisms of it, and I remember talking to one bishop on Monday morning before we even knew that they weren't going to vote on it, and he showed me his, draft of the language, and it was like a high school paper all marked up, and he just was beating his pen on it. He said, this language is so inexact. So I think for some it was deeply frustrating not to be able to go home and say, yes, we're taking this seriously, but for others, I think some of them went home breathing a quiet sigh of relief as well. And that's a really hard pill for a lot of lay Catholics to swallow.
One thing I saw, we don't know a lot because there's no FOIA in Holy Mother Church, which is extremely frustrating. But there is the Holy Spirit, and
all that is hidden will be revealed.
Right, exactly. One thing I saw that was sort of an outgrowth of this that may bear great fruit in the long run is that because they didn't have a whole lot to do once the Vatican put the proposals on ice, Cardinal DiNardo instituted what I sort of have been calling these open mic nights, where the bishops could come up and sort of say whatever they wanted about the sexual abuse crisis. And some of them said things that were very specific to the policies, and some of them just sort of said their thing. And there was I've been going to bishops' meetings for a long time, and there was more honesty and candor in that conversation than in any conversation I've seen at an Episcopal conference in ever. And people
but isn't that
agree.
kind of like when Al Gore was running for president and people would be like, oh man, you should hear Al Gore behind the scenes,
Yeah, I mean,
he's so charismatic.
I don't think it matters for this.
Right?
It was neat to see some of those guys talk like human beings. And so if one sort of outgrowth of this can be that the conference evolves from its very corporate structure into something which is more synodal, I didn't intend to say that, but more synodal, more fraternal and collaborative, that would be cool. But that's sort of a long-run structural thing that may happen but doesn't relate to what we need right now.
But the human beings thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, I feel like that's actually a nice distillation of a lot of what you see in sort of lay Catholic revulsion, which I agree seems to be at a higher point in certain ways this time than 15 years ago. Like, to me, one of the useful things about this wave of scandal is that I feel like I understand that wave of scandal a little better, in that, the extent to which you had figures as compromised as Cardinal McCarrick, former Cardinal McCarrick, in these positions made the broad behavior of bishops a lot more comprehensible. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there's so much, even now, of the episcopal language that is used to discuss these cases and, to sort of talk about these issues, that it's not that it seems un-Catholic, it's that it seems unhuman. Yeah. And I think, like the Vigano letter, right? The Vigano letter is a mess, and it's a mess precisely, as you were just saying, in that it collapses the theological civil war and the sex abuse crisis in a way that guaranteed that it would only be sort of positively received by a segment of conservative Catholicism. But one thing you can say for the Vigano letter is that it sounds like a human being. Yeah. Like that guy's a human being. And I even, and all of his interventions, every time they come out, part of me is like, oh, not again, but part of me is like, I know this guy.
Yeah.
And I think with a lot of the bishops, you read their reactions and how they handle things, and you're like, I don't even know this. Who is this person? Where is the person underneath all that? I mean, talk a little bit about, if you don't mind, how you hunted down and drove Cardinal McCarrick into exile on the Kansan Plains.
Oh, so my view, so I'm a huge Pope Francis fan, right? And sort of beginning, as soon as I was writing at the New Republic, I was writing very positive things about Pope Francis. I love Laudato Si, and so on and so forth. In fact, this is, I think, probably the only time I've ever been to your right on anything. So I was as surprised as anyone with Vigano's letter. At the same time, what came to mind is a sort of bit of advice an editor gave me years ago, which is whistleblowers are usually a little nuts. And so you often have to, with whistleblowers, factor in that there's going to be some amount of unusual material in whatever outcry you receive. But that doesn't mean that they're not right about something. And so I thought, well, you got to go to Uncle Ted, right? I mean, like, he's someone who would know. He was, at that point, already chastised. So then it was just a matter of finding him and trying to talk to him. At that time, his spokespeople were saying that he was too ill to receive visitors and to really converse coherently. That seemed kind of funny to me because I had someone who showed me text messages from him in June saying, hey, some stuff's about to come out, so my birthday party's off. He seemed pretty lucid. And so I started asking people, like, hey, do you know where McCarrick is? He can't be too far from here. And then it was a matter of getting parish property records and seeing that there were only a few properties that matched what people had heard. And then I figured out where he was at about 9 o'clock one evening. And so we put our kid in the car seat. My husband drove me over there and waited in the car filming when I went up and knocked on the door, and of course got Bishop Dorsonville, which is what I thought. Gave him my card and said, I'd like to speak to Theodore McCarrick. He's, yeah, how do you know he's here? And I was like, well, that's a giveaway. Which is something that's common with the cover-up in the church, is that the cover-up's happening poorly.
Keystone Cop cover-up. Yeah, it's a Keystone cover-up through and through.
And so I said, okay, well, I'll be back tomorrow. And I came back the next day, and that was when the Archdiocese called the Post and was like, this is threatening and frightening. And of course, it was me with my backpack.
But your husband is a large, he's a substantial man.
So Matt wasn't there the next day, right? This 6'3" guy with the 2-year-old in the back.
It's the 2-year-old that really terrifies.
That is a kind of threat. Yeah, we're going to let this kid in the house. But I mean, even then, it was very sad. I mean, it wasn't a triumphant. I didn't feel good about it, right? I was standing on the doorstep. I knocked. I rang the doorbell. And I waited, and I said, I'm just going to wait here because that's the advice Bob Woodward gave me. And you can oftentimes outwait people into something that'll give you more information about what you're trying to understand. And I had a letter I wanted to hand deliver, and I didn't want to mess with the mailbox because you can get in big trouble that way. And the nurse came, and she was like, it was time for her appointed time to, I guess, deal with McCarrick. And she knocked, and they thought it was me, and they wouldn't come to the door. And I kind of panicked. I was like, I don't want McCarrick to not be able to see his nurse, right? I'm not trying to interfere with his health care. It doesn't have to be that way, right? I mean, and I wish there was some way I could have made it clear that it wasn't me knocking anyway. She left. And I mean, I hated it. I hated it more than anything. And I left shortly after that. And it was a Pyrrhic defeat, right? After that, they moved him out to Virginia for a little bit and then up to Kansas. And I knew where he was in Virginia, and I told the diocese, I still know where he is. I'd still like to talk to him. They invited me to submit my questions in writing, and I did, and I had no thought that they would ever be answered, and they haven't been. But it just creates a lot of bad blood with, me and the Archdiocese, which is incidentally, my archdiocese, where I take my kid for Mass, is a place where, where I had her baptized, where McCarrick lived for a while in the rectory. But I keep thinking, you can make it all go away. Just tell the truth, right? Anytime you're in a situation that's like this, where every single move makes things somewhat worse, usually what you need to do is own up and tell the truth. And I think that it's only going to continue to increase in moral costs as long as that solution is put off.
Yeah.
Do you guys feel like Rome, I know there's no Rome, but people in Rome that you talk to share that view?
To tell the truth.
Well, I feel like we've reached a point in the American church where there is at least a substantial number of bishops who are willing to say that that's right.
Yeah, I think.
But I feel like there's the question, and this is the question that hangs over the Baltimore fiasco, right? Is this Rome saying, there are canonical law problems here and you're rushing something through for PR purposes and we're a universal church and we want there to be universal measures and it's all very reasonable? Is that what's going on? And I mean, we'll get part of an answer to that, I guess, in February, or is it that, there are a lot of people in Rome, some of them with a large amount of influence and power, who don't want, for instance, an American-led investigation into the ascent of Cardinal McCarrick, right? I mean, how much is the official story the true story, and how much is it, that people in Rome don't agree with Liz, basically?
All of those things. Somebody said to me that a helpful way to understand, maybe I read it in Bad Religion, I don't know, it's a good book. But somebody said to me that
Totally
one way
dated.
to kind of understand the huge cultural divide between us and Rome is that Americans are essentially sacramentalized Puritans, and Southern Europeans are essentially sacramentalized pagans. And the difference...
That's really good, and I can say it was not me.
Well, since I don't know who it was, I'm going to take it.
Yeah.
But the difference between those kinds of groups entering into the same Catholic Church are profound. And so we're shocked to discover that there's sin among the leaders of the church because we think that everybody with a collar is holy and not going to commit any sins. And the Italians are shocked to occasionally discover that there's a saint or someone who prays among them. Right? So it's the cultural differences there are huge. And so I think there is a way in which many people who are long-time sort of Vatican folks have a hard time understanding, not the magnitude, I mean, they understand the magnitude of this, but they have a hard time understanding why we seem so dispirited and deflated by the fact that the church is full of grave and profound sinners. Because all their beautiful buildings were built by grave and profound sinners who ran the church at various times. And so that difference is, and then we kind of expect that the rule of law will fix everything, and we have this idea that the USCCB is going to come up with 6 policies, and after 6 policies, bishops aren't going to commit any more sins, or we're going to catch them if they do. And that doesn't, that's sort of not the Roman way of thinking about things either. And maybe, there's a way in which it's not a Catholic way either, because I think part of our challenge is to come to grips with a church that is from top to bottom composed of sinners. If St. Paul is chief among sinners, then we shouldn't expect that others won't be too. And then sort of to reconcile that with our understanding of what it means to be Catholic, what it means for our own sinfulness and for our own call to holiness and for theirs. So there's this big cultural divide that comes with that. I also think there are people who are concerned about the particularities of an investigation or their connection to it, people who have not been particularly forthcoming at high levels of the church. The Holy Father has been struggling to account for a number of sexual abuse crises in a number of countries where he's been accused of not acting quickly enough, Chile most notably, where he's accused of having gotten a letter in 2015 and not done anything until 2018, and there are others too. So, all those things come together, I think, to make it the kind of standstill that we're at.
The only thing I'd add is that I think we just have to be careful in our talking about this and in our reporting not to conflate it all together. I mean, the McCarrick investigation is very separate than the new proposals for bishops' accountability. And while there may be similar motivations, by certain players here in Rome or elsewhere, when we talk about that, I think we do have to distinguish between the two. I mean, different things are going on at different levels in both of those situations.
So I want to open this up in a second, but I'll ask you as a final panelist question. Each of you, if you had the ear of the Pope or were the Pope and you could do one thing, I mean, as your Pope, you can do a lot of things, but we'll stick with one. Like, what is the thing that should be done? Where, in terms of we are Americans, we have a juridical legal mindset, but it doesn't have to be a juridical legal thing. What would you do?
I'd put a mother as your sort of czar of sex abuse cases.
I grew up in Texas, and my mother's family was from Louisiana, and they used to say, when you were lying about something, tell the truth and shame the devil, which was tell the truth even though it's going to hurt you, even though you're going to get in trouble, because you will have done the right thing. And that's the first step towards redemption. And I would say, before anything else, before any procedural change, before any policy comes forward, you just have to adopt a policy of telling the truth even when it hurts you, because it's a religion that has a radical sacrifice at the center of it. Radical self-sacrifice is at the middle of Christianity. It's the only reason anyone who believes in Christianity, right, is because it's a thing that inspires faith. If Jesus would sacrifice himself for you, that's something that you can be a part of, something you can believe in, something you can invest everything in, right? And people want to feel that way about the church. I understand people are sinners. There are also different gradations of sin. And some of the gradations of sin here have also taken on the form of habit. And the only way to get out of it at this point, the only way to get anything more than a bunch of different kinds of defeat over time is to tell the truth. And it's going to hurt. And that's the only thing that can save you.
I was thinking about the number of people who would like me to say, I'd answer the dubia, but that's not really that's not my actual answer. That's not my answer.
Wrong panel.
I was just thinking,
It's already on the record.
I was just thinking how many people would be so excited but that's not my answer. Absolution forgives the sin, and that's a whole other conversation. Absolution forgives the sin, but penance is the thing that restores justice and reconciles the relationship. And whether I felt as the Pope that I had personal culpability or not, I do a penance, a big public penance, and I invite all my other brothers to kind of walk the Via Penitentia with me, and we'd go from there. And then policies and that. And Chris is right. Women who are mothers who are connected to this are hugely important. But I think penance is one of those things that reconciles relationships.
I wouldn't be surprised if come February and I would hope actually at February that it would start off with a big public penance service.
And I hope that people will take it, if that's so, I hope people won't see it as window dressing, but as the essential sort of component of who we are. Yeah.
All right, let's have some questions. So there's two microphones here, and let's start right there because it's conveniently located next to the microphone. And then again, hopefully I'll be getting questions from the internet on this device. But if I don't, I'm sure you guys can carry us through. Please identify yourself and just obviously a brief question or at least a statement that ends with a lift in your voice so it sounds like a question would be ideal.
Thank you, Ross. Dawn Eden Goldstein, Holy Apostles College and Seminary. Thank you for arranging this panel. It's been great to hear these different points of view. I want to go to something that J.D. Flynn mentioned with respect to being a journalist in the online world, where often you're in the online world, you said there's concern for hits. Now, one thing that's true of everyone on this panel is that none of you are with a news source that deals in sensationalism. Certainly, you're concerned about having interesting headlines, but you're not concerned.
Not everyone agrees with that. It's very kind of you.
But you're not concerned
not everyone
with
shares that take.
clickbait. Now, there are clickbait websites. Different people may have their own different ideas of what those are. For example, LifeSite News is sort of, I would say, in between. There's some journalism. There's also some clickbait. I know from personal experience that on the journalistic side, they don't always check with their sources or make corrections as any of your news organizations would. Then there are what I would call the info wars of the Catholic online world, namely 1 Peter 5, Rorate Caeli, and I'm sure others here can think of more. Now, it seems that just as Fox News is sometimes getting ideas for stories from InfoWars, it seems that phenomenon that's hit mainstream journalism is beginning to hit mainstream Catholic news sites as well. Ross, I'm thinking of in your book how you will use 1 Peter 5. Or someone who's a more sensational writer, such as John Zamirak, and use their accounts of what Pope Francis said, rather than going to Zenit or some organization that's putting Francis in context. So I'd like to ask you, Ross, and all of you, do you think that there's been some InfoWars type infiltration of the mainstreaming of extremist websites, and if so, what do you think can or should be done about that? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to answer quickly, but I also specifically want to punt to JD because you've had a lot of interactions.
Those guys don't like me, yeah.
With people, with sort of critics from essentially from your right, who think that you're a milquetoast. But first, I'll just speak for myself and say that my sense of things in the church is that there is a segment of the Catholic press that is prone to conspiracy theories and alarmism. At the same time, and this has been true with the sex abuse crisis, and I know you and I disagree on this, but I think in certain cases it's been true with some of the theological battles of the Francis pontificate. I think there have been times when the extremists have been willing to say things and raise issues and raise stories that other outlets weren't touching, that turned out to be more accurate descriptions of what was going on. And I'm very comfortable saying that's been true of the sex abuse crisis because I saw it in my own life. That if you went back to 2003 and people would come up to you during that scandal. I was, a young journalist at the time, but I might not be on the panel. I'd be at the panel, and people would say things to me that I thought were ridiculous and totally implausible, like that Cardinal McCarrick took priests and seminarians to his beach house and molested them, hypothetically, except not hypothetically. And those were the kind of things that at that time, it was either what you might call the far left of the Catholic press, the National Catholic Reporter, or places like The Wanderer and other traditionalist outlets that were covering that stuff. And, in many cases, they were right. And I think that, the InfoWars problem with those sites is a real problem, but it doesn't change the fact that there have been a lot of things that mainstream Catholic journalists didn't want to believe were true that turned out to be true. And I sort of bear that in mind in how I relate to the fringe, as bad as the fringe can sometimes be. But you have a more direct relation, a more adversarial relationship with some of those sites.
Well, the thing is, I don't want to have an adversarial relationship with them, but I do. I think it's because of Twitter. I wish that I didn't have it, but I do. And
it's like a disease.
Right.
There's no antidote yet.
Exactly. I think it's really important to recognize that there are extremists who are angry on both sides, that there are extremists in the church who are angry from the left and extremists who are angry from the right. And so it's not just a right problem, and I think it often gets painted that way. I also think it's important to differentiate between people who hold strong views about the Second Vatican Council and the Mass, the extraordinary form of the Mass and Dignitatis Humanae and ecumenism, and are genuinely sort of trying to promote their strong views, but are trying to do so with integrity, who get lumped into people who I think are just sort of trying to be very loud and create a great deal of chaos, and I'm not even sure what their ends are all the time. And those groups get lumped in, and I think that's unfair, and we have to be careful about that. But it's also true, I think sometimes those guys get mad at us because they tell us, they'll say to me, well, that the church is full of this, or that there's a huge homosexual problem in every seminary in America, that. And they get mad at me because my response is, well, I'm open to the possibility of these things, but we don't put things on our website until we verify them, until we have facts that are connected with them. And I think sometimes there's a real frustration. People want you to just sort of say what you think and treat it as news. And for those who aren't willing to do that, they feel like we're, in my case, a lot of people say that everyone but bishops says that I'm in the sort of the pocket of the bishops, and then the bishops say, why are you writing all this stuff that we don't like? So you can't win, I guess, in some ways. But that phenomena is, I think, largely people who feel that their voices have not been heard within the institution, and then they self-perpetuate into something that creates a whole lot of anger. But I have empathy for people who feel that those voices haven't been heard, or who feel like they're not getting what they need from the church, and then are sort of sucked into that world.
So I'll take a question from the internet next, which relates to your talking about bishops. Is there something that individual bishops can do within their own jurisdictions, their own dioceses, to address these scandals, apart from acts of penance and openness? Like, is there a particular step if you were, running for your seminaries, because you brought up seminaries? Is there something that bishops should be doing on their own right now that they aren't?
They can release their records.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the low-hanging fruit, it seems. When after the Monday morning bombshell that, the bishops couldn't vote on this, most of us in the press corps went outside to listen to the protest. And sort of what bishop accountability groups and survivor groups wanted was a release of names of credibly accused priests. And I think just offering that would be a very tangible step forward. And many said, if they do this between now and February, we will see some sort of forward motion that we're sort of maybe not okay with, but it's a step in the right direction.
And I would be very careful to make those lists very accurate, right down to, in a lot of cases, these credibly accused priests, their accusations ended in closed settlements, and these settlements basically failed to resolve what was a disagreement between oftentimes the archdiocese and the victims about what exactly the archdiocese had done. So some ambiguity exists there, and the result of that is going to be, if you put these lists out with details that are disputed by the victims, it's only going to make things worse. If the lists themselves appear to be inconsistent with what victims and parishioners know, and obviously in Buffalo that created a huge disaster when there was an incomplete list released, and the Archdiocese of Washington has released its own list that victims have questions about. And so release records very accurately would be my advice.
Just a side note, one bishop said to me during Baltimore, I don't want to, I'm happy to release the names of all of my accused priests, but I think we should have a directory of priests in good standing, because I'm tired of my priests having to worry about if people are wondering about them. I'd never heard that floated, but it was just something new that sort of emerged.
Yeah, and I think that's fair as well, because priests have to live with a stigma at this point. Right? People say disgusting things to them on the street. I have a friend who's a priest, who's a high school teacher, and the kids always say horrible things to their teachers, but now, you can imagine the abuse. And it's awful.
Credibility is a term of art in the church. It doesn't mean, when we hear the word credibility, most of us think, oh yeah, that means it probably happened. You release a list of credibly accused priests, and I think the concern is most people think, oh yeah, those guys are probably guilty. In the church, when we talk about credibility, bishops use it in various ways, but they're connecting it to the canonical ideas that are more akin to sort of, could it have happened? Was the guy in the country at the time when he was said to have been in the country? Is it not manifestly false or frivolous? Does it have some semblance of connection to reality? And so if the bishops just release names of credibly accused priests and they don't explain that, a great many priests who have not done anything are going to suffer as a consequence of that. And if they do explain that, they're going to have to explain it extremely well and often, because if you're on a list that says credibly accused of sexual abuse, it doesn't matter what's at the top of the list or the bottom of the list. And so that's hard. I think bishops are going to have to figure that out, or get a better term, or figure out the right threshold. Where in the process do we release the name? Because the establishment of credibility is pretty early in the process. The person hasn't necessarily had the right to defend themselves yet, and I think we still believe in the rule of law and due process when people are accused of sexual misconduct. I hope that we do as a church. And so bishops are going to have to figure out, and probably together, where's the point at which we release names. I think people want transparency in the process. They want to know this is what the church is doing when she hears that someone has been accused of misconduct. And there's been sort of the veneer of transparency in the process, but maybe there are reports that bishops can give that give more details about what the review boards have done. If there's this metropolitan idea for metropolitans to look into their suffragan bishops, which has a lot of merits, maybe metropolitans could sort of release information about the processes that they do. But the information has to be comprehensive enough that we're not sort of indicting priests who have not yet had any opportunity to defend themselves.
I think we heard that a lot in Baltimore. We
Yeah.
need uniform standards
Yeah.
for this. So.
And I do think due process is very important. Right?
Yeah,
And
absolutely,
it can't be overlooked just because of the situation is severe. It doesn't mean there aren't going to be, like you're saying, frivolous complaints that get thrown in from time to time. And so, I mean, if it's a matter of releasing records, as for Southern California had to do that in a few settlements, and those are pretty enlightening on how the process worked as well. And so, especially if you have convicted priests, I don't see the harm in just releasing those personnel records. That'll give people a good insight into how the process works. But more clarity here seems to be better than less, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I can say from personal experience that a priest who I know very well is currently, quote unquote, credibly accused, and this has been publicized in our parish, and he is, his faculties are suspended. And, I don't want to do the thing where you say you're morally certain he's innocent, because we've learned that that's an unwise thing to say, but I think he's very likely innocent. And it's sort of a striking thing to watch, how the language of credible accusation creates a presumption of guilt around something that right now is one allegation from 25 years ago that is probably not going to result in his suspension. So it seems, I mean, it's complicated, right?
It is.
The other thing I do if I was a bishop is I'd establish a set of sort of graduated and consistent penalties and processes for priests who have moral failings with women or men or seminarians, and so that people knew what to expect and priests did too, because that's a huge point of ambiguity now.
Is that something that can be done? I mean, this is a canonical question, right? Can that be done by bishops?
My canon law professors in the room, I think yes.
You think yes? You think an individual
He's
bishop
nodding, yes.
can
An
say,
individual
he's nodding,
bishop could
an
establish
individual
those-
bishop can say,
could establish some
if
penalties
you-
and processes to say in our diocese, if you have a moral failing, if you commit an act of sexual misconduct with a grown-up under these circumstances, these are the penalties, and if you do it twice, these are the penalties, and if you
And if
do it
it's in the
three times-
Thornbirds,
Right.
it's like, right. I'm sorry.
I think
you
there's
have
a lot
to.
of unclarity in the language in the
Yeah,
reporting that's
absolutely,
not
yeah.
helpful. When we say, there was sexual misconduct with a priest and a grown woman, some people are going to say, okay, so knowing the Catholic Church, that was a rape, right?
Right,
But it's
right,
not
exactly.
necessarily
Yeah,
that,
right,
and so there's a
exactly,
lot
yeah.
of difficulty with really ambiguous language.
Yeah, and distinguishing between coercive sexual activity
Right.
and
Right.
Cardinal Cupich took a lot of heat for saying there's a difference between sexual activity with adults and sexual activity with children. But there is, we all know that. And so the church has to figure out a way to address that in a real way too.
All right, let's take one from the real world. Yes.
How are you? My name is Chris Ruddy. I teach theology here at CUA. This semester I'm teaching a doctoral seminar called Contemporary Problems in Ecclesiology. And I finished my...
You're beating them off with a stick at the classroom door.
I finished my syllabus, I thought, the Saturday before classes started. And then I went out to dinner with my family at another family's house and came back, and Archbishop Vigano had released the letter. So I had to go back to the drawing board and work on the syllabus again. As we're reflecting on this throughout the semester, it's like an ecclesiological lab in real time every week. The question I have with this is that I believe it was John Allen who said early on...
Don't trust that guy.
After the release of,
He's my boss.
after the release of Archbishop Vigano's letter, he said, I think it was him, he said, if you think that the press is going to back off this story, when they think they can take somebody big down, he said, you've got another thing coming. No journalist is going to pass up a chance at a Pulitzer with that. But I'm very struck by the failure, really, I think, to follow up on McCarrick, particularly in the secular press, and various reasons for that. One, I have a question for you with this. One, how much of the difficulty comes from a lack of access to documentation? This is something that everybody's asking for, a release of all documentation in Rome and Washington. Secondly, how much of it is due to ideology? This is something that Rod Dreher has mentioned. in the sense of saying, to what degree do people not want the Pope to be compromised or to go down if in fact he has done something or not done something he should have? So the question I have here is, this makes getting to the bottom of the McCarrick affair, I think, more difficult, because it can just be limited as sort of a bunch of, right-wing nuts trying to figure out what's going on with him, when there aren't other sources who are pursuing this. And maybe they are, maybe this is underway, but I think until that happens, we're going to be more of a standstill at getting to the bottom of this. And I wonder how you respond to that as journalists, whether it's for Catholic institutions or particularly for non-Catholic or secular institutions.
I think that there's a bias towards breaking news, at least at secular news institutions, especially when we have a great religion team, that does our reporting, but it's a small team. It's a 10th, 20th of the size of other desks that deal with, say, national news. And so they're going to have a tendency to focus on breaking news and getting clarity and coverage on stories that are coming out right now. And from that point of view, when your job is to cover breaking stories, McCarrick, all this happened 25 years ago. I talked to someone whose story I reported in the Post who was abused by McCarrick before I was born. And so I think for a lot of reporters, the question is like, well, when you have a crisis that's kind of sprawling and big and things are still happening in it, it's difficult to justify putting the man hours and the resources into getting clarity on something that happened 25 odd years ago with someone who's no longer in active ministry, who's been penalized already. And so you kind of, that's a factor. The lack of documentation is a factor. I know that in New Jersey, there's a special counsel now who's looking into the seminary at Seton Hall, where McCarrick was active when he was in Newark. So I suspect there will be a lot of documentation forthcoming. In fact, to my knowledge, the first discovery day was last week. So eventually there will be documents of some kind, but right now they're not forthcoming. And then the last issue with McCarrick, is that everybody loved him. And a lot of people still love him. And a lot of victims I talk to, remember him as Uncle Ted and completely trusted him. And it's hard to put yourself, unless you've been in that situation or you've dealt with a lot of victims, in the mindset of someone who feels like they're betraying someone who was good to them when they come forward. Or in some cases, these were like working class Irish American Catholic families in New York when McCarrick was up there in the late 70s and early 80s. And their parents let McCarrick into their homes, and they feel like it would be like accusing my mom and dad of participating in my abuse if I came forward about this. And so there are institutional barriers. There is an institutional bias in any news network that covers breaking and developing news, and that there's the smallness of teams, there's the limited resources that go into religion reporting. Those are all challenges. And then there are just the emotional and spiritual challenges of people who know things about him. And so those have been the issues I've seen with covering McCarrick. But I'm still following up, so there will still be more stuff forthcoming, because I consider it, right, DC's my hometown, and also being an op-ed columnist, no one really cares what I'm doing at any given time. So I file stuff on time, and they're like, Liz, she's in New York this week. Good luck to you. But with the religion reporters, they have real jobs. So they're a little bit more pressed for time.
Yeah, I mean, I can say, our religion and Rome reporters literally wrote a story shortly after the Vigano letter came out that was just talking about all the people who refused to talk to them, right? And that is an inevitable, you have American publications reporting on the mysterious Vatican that only John Allen truly understands, right? And when doors are closed, it's not the same as like covering the Trump White House, where there's always someone ready to leak to you. There are no language barriers, there are no cultural barriers, and so on. So that's, I think the Vatican, there are ways in which the Vatican can more successfully stonewall the New York Times than an American politician can successfully stonewall the New York Times, or an American bishop, right? And that's part of why you can and you will continue to get stories in America without getting necessarily clarity on the stuff that goes up to Rome, is just that difference in sort of where journalists have access and sources. I think it would be false to ignore the fact that there is a narrative that a lot of journalists believe in, where liberals are reformers and good guys, and conservatives are against reform and are bad guys, and that has some influence on the story. I don't think it has a dispositive influence. I can certainly say that the religion reporters of the New York Times would love to get the Pulitzer that you're talking about, but it has some influence. I was on Fareed Zakaria's show, and he basically asked me that question. He was like, this whole thing with Pope Francis is so baffling because he's a reformer, right? And the conservatives are criticizing him, and there was just a sort of puzzlement. And Fareed's a smart guy. He knows how the world works probably better than I do. But there is that narrative that I think, at the very least, the situation in the church should complicate, and that has some effect on coverage. And then what Archbishop Wensky said, though, is also true, right? Like, the Trump all the time thing, it just pushes other stories out of the news in ways that even, the Boston stuff happened after 9/11, and you would have thought that, the global war on terror would have pushed that out. But the global war on terror, as a shaper of media coverage, has nothing on Donald Trump. Yeah. And that's true. The Archbishop was right.
And then the secular media, or the media that is not specifically Catholic, you can put it that way, it covers religion as religion. So they're looking at the Tree of Life shooting, they're looking at all kinds of things. We don't have specific Catholic units, and that does make a big difference in sort of the allocation of resources, because there are always a lot of stories going on with religion. There are Muslim women elected to Congress and all these different stories that get covered.
I'll just add, though, there was the story that came out the week before the bishops' meeting from the Boston Globe and the Philly Inquirer, where they had spent, I think it was a team of 4, had spent, 2 months on it. So I think, some outlets are still sort of releasing people to cover this. And I mean, that story was much discussed at the bishops' meeting, not so favorably from the floor, from the bishops there, but people were paying attention to it. It was one small effort. So.
Yeah. Religious literacy, a lot of secular journalists have asked us in recent weeks just to give us a sort of, to give them sort of a glossary on terms that, for those of us who work in the Catholic press, who just come as second nature, but breaking through that, just cultural barrier is a big one too.
Yeah. I had to explain to a secular reporter what it means to break a vow of chastity. And,
right.
I mean, you would...
Well, Chris didn't have to describe it as much in detail as he did.
They got your drift after a while.
What clericalism means? You can't get it nailed down.
So here's another internet question, maybe a more personal one. Have you guys talked to seminarians and young priests about this? You guys have mentioned it a tiny bit, but if so, what, both how are they processing this, and what advice is there for the church from their experience right now?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have talked to seminarians, and newly ordained priests, I think, are kind of an interesting sort of lot to look at as well. One bishop told me that, he did his first sort of round of listening sessions, and one of the newly ordained priests who had just been ordained last spring raised his hand and said, Archbishop, am I going to have to deal with this? I was just ordained, for the foreseeable future. And he said, yeah, buckle up. You got to deal with this for the rest of your life. That's the sort of reality. So morale, I think, is, incredibly low. But, most of the folks that are in the seminary have, we hope, done a dutiful discernment period. And I think, how's this for sort of spiritual testing?
Anybody who signs up to be a priest in 2018 is not doing it for the glory or the power that they're going to get or the respect that they're going to get, right? They're signing up to be vilified. And what I've seen with seminarians who I've spoken with and young priests I've spoken with is a clarity of mission and of purpose. So guys who will say together, yeah, we see the problems in the priesthood that have caused this. We see the dangers of isolation and alcoholism and loneliness, and so we're going to commit to a different way of living insofar as we're able. And we know that we're either going to be kind of the re-evangelists of America, or we're not going to have congregations by the time we're dead. And so I've seen just a renewed sort of vigor and commitment on the part of guys who are there. I don't know if there are more or fewer. I never remember to pay attention to that, but the ones who I've seen there I'd say true believers and truly committed to the thing.
I remember when I was at Cambridge, I had a priest for a tutor who asked me to call him by his first name. At the time, I think I was 22 or something, and he was probably 34, and to me that seemed like a huge difference. He said, "Oh, just call me John." And I was like, no, never. I'd never call a priest by their first name. It's always Father this or Father that. And I didn't realize at the time the loneliness that can be part of the vocation, and that it can be nice to just kind of have a friend. And so in talking to priests and seminarians, especially newly ordained priests right now, I mean, a lot of these guys are around my age. So I just tried to be there as a friend, bring people over for dinner. I know it's as difficult for them as it is for the lay faithful, and in many ways more difficult or differently so. And so there has to be an accompaniment there from the lay faithful, I think.
So we're getting towards 5:30, so what I'm going to do is take one question from each side of the room. The oldest trick in the book is to take two questions at once, and then we'll all try and answer both of them together. Yes.
Hi, I'm Mary Cieslak, and I'm here as myself. But I did graduate from Catholic University. I was wondering, all of you have spoken to some degree on the level of the priests being on the ground and the bishops, the archbishops, the pope being very separated from what is happening with the laity here in America and in all the other countries that are having this current crisis right now. And I was wondering, the word clericalism is often tossed around now in reports on this. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts on the level that clericalism has contributed to this, and what it also contributes to preventing that reconciliation, that healing from happening right now?
Okay. Clericalism. Yes. Oh. I meant the gentleman with the tastefully silvered hair.
Mike Kelsey, I'm a seminarian actually here for DC. And I was just curious, one of the odd journalistic aspects seems to be the delay between, say, when the church notes something's coming, like Pennsylvania Report, and then the almost like shock they act, like when it comes out. And just as journalists, do you have any insight on kind of that seeming strange inability potentially to grasp what's happening, what's coming, how do they deal with that? Thanks.
Do you mean, just to clarify, do you mean the shock of in the press, or the shock of like bishops and archbishops dealing with the reaction?
Of the church. It actually seems like there's a lot of people say they knew what was coming, and at a certain point there was a very long gap between when people had to know what was coming,
right,
and then the like panic, quickness that they react to things seems very strange.
So you can answer either question or both at once by blaming clericalism for this this gap.
I read a long Rosica essay the other day on clericalism, and I still don't have any idea what it means. It's like neoliberalism. Every time I see it in an article, it seems to have a radically different meaning from the last time I read about it. I'm sure there's a meaning, just like with the word neoliberal, there's a meaning, but it must have been lost in the 80s.
One of the articles I read recently that was helpful talking about clericalism just put it like this, it's a culture in where sort of every sort of, whether it's priests or bishops, they're only used to answering up. So where priests are always answering up to the bishop, or bishops always answering up to, the Pope, or and the sort of culture that creates, in which they have completely sort of removed engagement and the ability to listen from the laity. And I think that's not an encompassing definition, but I think that gets to a huge part of the problem.
Do you think that's what's going on? Do you think that's do you think you can put that at kind of the center of the crisis in a way?
It's certainly there in the mix. I mean, I think Pope Francis is certainly, and I think Pope Francis's understanding of clericalism is much broader. And I think what we're seeing now is, yes, there's canonical changes that he wants, but also a cultural change. And I think the bishops here and elsewhere have to sort of distill down further to understand what that means.
There's a bishop in Baltimore who said, they're talking about this complaint line and then this sort of lay investigative committee. And he said, it would be better, more appropriate for bishops to be judged by not just one other bishop, but by a panel of bishops, because nobody understands being a bishop like a bishop. And that struck me as being part of what clericalism is the idea that bishops, priests are separate, that they would not be held to the ordinary standards of Christian behavior that we would expect from other people. And I honestly think that sometimes laity can be more responsible for clericalism than clerics, that we have a tendency, maybe increasingly less so, but we have a tendency to put Father on a pedestal and His Excellency on a double pedestal, and His Eminence is right there next to Our Lady. And so we can kind of foster that attitude ourselves. The best boss that I ever had who was a bishop said, you don't work for me, you work for Jesus Christ, and if you think that I'm not doing something, you ought to tell me. Now, sometimes I would tell him and he'd say, thank you, go away, and that was fine too. But there's not enough. I think there could be more of that listening. Why didn't the Pennsylvania grand jury report, why didn't people understand the magnitude of it? I think that people, I mean, you can say sort of it was very graphic and very detailed and people were shocked by that. But I think that's the time when a lot of people started to realize this isn't the paradigm of 2002 and thereafter. So 2002 was about the priests, but after that the narrative was often about there are a lot of people out there who want to hurt the church and who are using the sexual abuse crisis to hurt the church, and it becomes sort of an us and them. And I don't think anyone expected that Catholics would read the Pennsylvania grand jury report and themselves be as hurt and as angry. People who go to Mass, daily communicants, the core Catholics would be as angry and hurt. And that's, I think, the first time that the bishops started to see this isn't an outside problem, this is an inside problem. And it's hard to know how to respond to that.
But don't you think it's also, they weren't expecting the McCarrick thing to hit? I mean, I feel like the McCarrick thing then also conditioned secular press coverage of Pennsylvania, where I think probably there were people in Pennsylvania who thought, this will come out and it'll be a 2-day story, but these are mostly cases from 25 years ago, and I feel like they thought, we can have a narrative which is, this is the past and we're doing better in the present.
Those are the talking points that they had, and suddenly those talking points didn't work, and because of McCarrick and the realization that, okay, some of these things are maybe still happening in some ways in the church, or these things that we thought the bishops had handled, maybe they hadn't in the way that we thought, and so those old wounds became new wounds.
And I think back to the June bishops meeting in Fort Lauderdale this summer, and I mean the bishops, I think it's fair to say, were as united as you could have hoped for, because their main concern was the family separation happening at the border. I mean, there was a report from the head of the National Review Board where he offered some critiques of the current policies in place, but no one, I think, expected 10 days later to be hit with this.
And I think that the McCarrick story circulated for years before it ever found publication. And I think that there are many, many, many stories like that reporters know about, and they ask for comment and they try to get further information, but somewhere in the process it stalls out. And that happens several times with McCarrick. And this just happened to be the one time where the press came and asked for comment and the story really published. And so I think there's probably a lot of guessing on whether or not these are actually going to come out or be published, or whether reporters are really going to stick to it, or other news is going to take over, especially, in light of the news cycle's shortness now.
It should be said there are bishops who had to fight to get the McCarrick story out, who had to fight to get it to be treated in the way that it was. I mean, Cardinal Dolan especially had to say, we're going to handle this according to the way we handle processes, and deserves, I think, an extraordinary amount of credit for that, whatever else.
So on the clericalism front, though, I also think there is something, so part of what it means is this idea of like, you give up so much to be a priest, so you deserve special treatment. But I think connected to that, and I felt this reading your piece on, you wrote about the courage apostolate, right? And sort of, this is the Catholic organization that takes an orthodox view of homosexuality and gay sex, and works with same-sex attracted Catholics and tries to help them live chaste lives. And you wrote a story about how they contributed to arguments that were used to sort of keep predatory priests in circulation, because the theory of courage was that obviously that not that orientation can change, but that behavior can change, and that nobody is sort of, and so this was then applied to priests in cases where it pretty obviously shouldn't have been. And what struck me reading that was, how you have a very different theological perspective there than you get from, some cases where it was a more liberal Catholic climate and so on. But you end up getting exactly the same behavior. And to me, I just wondered, we live through an era where there's a massive priest shortage in the United States, right? And the church went through this huge trauma in the 60s and 70s, which was also the time when actual abuse of children was at its worst, where, priests and nuns left formation, left seminary in huge numbers, and numerically the priesthood has never recovered from that. And when I read these accounts of bishops keeping priests in circulation, the emphasis on saving his priesthood, right, it's such a through line, and it's clericalism of a certain kind, but it's clericalism that maybe is just connected to the sense of we just don't have enough priests, and this guy is a priest. We have to save his priesthood for the sake of the church, even if that means turning a blind eye, or not turning a blind eye, but sort of forgiving and moving on. Does that resonate? Do you think that's...
I have been, as a canon lawyer, I've been in the room with a lot of priests who have fallen in one way or another. He comes into the bishop, and now the decision has to be made about what's going to happen. To borrow a term from W, I think it's compassionate clericalism. I think that the bishop oftentimes sees his son who has fallen, his priest who has fallen. So I don't know if it's sort of numbers in this calculation. It's that if any of our children committed a grave and serious crime in the midst of a personal crisis, it's natural that we would think about how do I get my child healed before we would remember the demands of justice. And for bishops, that's not okay. It's not okay that they only remember their broken son, but it's understandable, and I think it's the reason why there need to be mothers and fathers in the room and laity who are involved in that process and all of those things. But I do think the bishop is sometimes blinded by that in a way that's born out of, I think, a disorder of charity, blinded by that love for his priest and his desire for his priest to be healed, and he forgets about the rest of it.
Well, that clericalism is thinking of the priest as being your son in a way that his victim is not, maybe.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right, yeah.
All right, well, on that slightly grim note, thank you all so much for coming. I'm sure the panelists will be happy to stick around and be buttonholed with further questions. I really appreciate... I was going to say, I really appreciate CUA's role in hosting this. These are hard, challenging conversations. There are a lot of unanswered questions about where the church goes from here, and I'm not sure we're any closer to those answers, but we're working on it. So thank you guys again.